Hi, welcome to Tea Time. Today we're going to talk about stress and its relation to transitioning. And maybe some things that we can also learn or take away how we can help manage ourselves. Because transitioning is a lot, babe. Like there's so much going on. And if you can't feel like you can't do anything because there's just so much for you, then I totally understand. I get it. I'm with you. These past 2 weeks, I have kind of slacked on making my videos. I've slacked on just exercising and taking care of just the core of myself, not doing much because I've been so stressed out with all of the international flights and scheduling for all of the surgeries and things I'm going to do in January and talking to all these healthcare systems and all of that, like on an international scale it's a lot. And then trying to balance that with work and all of that, man, I thought I was done with the stress of transitioning. I'm like 2.5, almost 3 years in, and I'm at a new phase of the stress, babe. Like there's so much more. But I also remember in the beginning of transitioning on the job, it was super, super stressful. And I don't know where you are in your transition. Let me know, because I'd love to hear kind of what kind of things are stressing you out or what kind of experiences you're stressing out. But there's these waves as you transition of all the different things you got to do if you're going for a medical transition and you're also aspiring to surgery and things like that. When you first start, and you realize you're trans, right? Do you remember this? You're like, oh crap, I have to come out to my friends and family. I have to come out to work. I don't even have all of the outfits, or I don't even know how to look in the way that I want to look. I don't even know how to express. I don't even have my voice. And it's just this huge pile of things that gets a little overwhelming, right? And that's kind of the first phase of, I'd say, the stress of transitioning is that coming to terms with all of these things. How am I going to engage in the world? Am I going to be safe? All of these initial questions. And then comes once you start moving on those things, getting your hormones, talking to the doctors, finding the right people to work with, then you kind of move into another phase, which I feel is the moving all of these things along phase, where now you've got all the stuff in place, but now you have to keep doing it. And when you're doing it, it can be exhausting. Do you remember having to go through that part where you have to deal with all of these extras, appointments and places to go, and you have to do these things that are necessary for your transition, but you just don't want to do all of them at the same time and you're feeling exhausted? I don't know, maybe that's just for me. But while you're doing this, you're also finding yourself and understanding who you are. And I guess that's actually really the big middle chunk of the transition. It's finding who you are, knowing where you stand within yourself, and growing and expanding into the world. And that process, if you were to just take that and break that into pieces in terms of how that works, there's sort of this thing where you have the old self, the self where you go, okay, I don't want this anymore. And then you have this aspiring vision for who you want to be, because you can sense it, you can feel it. Do you remember that? Where you were okay, I want to get rid of my old self, and then I want to get my new self, and I kind of just want to say get out of town, go away, old self, please go away. That's kind of the two main pieces. You want to get rid of the old and then make room for the new. And that kind of works because you say, okay, well, I'm not going to speak masculinely, I'm going to dress femininely, I'm going to express femininely. But to get from here to here, there's all of this practice and change and iteration and kind of pushing and pulling of the old self coming back because they're in your subconscious. So there's this big middle, and I think this is what we call the transition often. I'm transitioning. This is the big piece, is the finding yourself in the distance between the old self and the new self. And it's the most confusing part because you don't feel like you have a foundation for where you're standing because it's shifting constantly. You go, well, that's not me anymore. This is me, and I am expressing and understanding who I am. Have you ever said something like that to yourself where you've consciously decided to separate yourself from an old behavior and you're wanting to replace it with a new one. But as you're trying to replace it, the old one keeps coming up and you have to keep consciously kind of disconnecting that and re-engaging a new one. That's confusing, and especially if you don't have your voice down or you don't have your expression down, it can feel like you're not even able to express who you are and see it within how you speak. So you can't even reaffirm it back to yourself because you may look in the mirror and not see but know that you're different, and you may not express the way that you know you're different, and it may not feed back into you. And this cycle in itself is really important, is you become a feedback loop of your own perception of who you are as you transition. What I mean by that is, if you look at yourself in the mirror and you say, for me, I'm a woman, I'm a woman, I'm a woman, and you start to give yourself permission to see that, you're allowing yourself to recondition who you think you are until eventually you start to see a woman in the mirror, and then you start to believe that, and you start to internalize that because you now have external evidence. The worst part of the transition is when you use this external evidence to invalidate your gender identity. For example, you put on a dress and you look at your body and say, man, my body does not fit this dress at all, and it's a man's body, and blah, 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 blah. And now what you've done is you've used evidence of the external world to invalidate who you actually are, and you're holding that on over your head. Have you ever done that? Have you ever felt that dysphoria? Have you ever felt the crushing tears involved in looking at that and coming to terms with that reality? That's happened to me a bunch of times, and I've learned how to avoid it. And if you're in the thick of this, it's okay. You're going to get through that. Don't worry. Just keep reaffirming to yourself that you are who you believe and feel you are. You just have to recondition yourself, and you have to stop relying off of your judgment to believe that the external reality and your perception of it are accurate, and that external reality dictates your reality inside. You have to flip it and say the internal reality is who I am, what I see and know who I am, and I can project that onto my external reality until eventually it becomes real. But in this in-between state, it doesn't seem like it's real because I'm still grappling with this old self. It's complicated. Aliens. No. So that's kind of the big thing. And then I'm kind of on this other end here where I'm now I've gotten to the point of, okay, so I understand and I've found and I've integrated who I feel I am, but there's still now this new part where I say, hey, hang on a second, some of that old self, that was actually super me, and I just wasn't comfortable with it because it was so tied up with who I thought I was at the time that I wanted to get rid of it because I associated it as masculine, as male. And so now you kind of go back to pulling the parts that you discarded and bringing it back into your reality today, into your reality tomorrow. And this part is really interesting because the things that gave me dysphoria no longer give me dysphoria. And I'll give you a very concrete example about blowjobs. So I would never let anyone, any guy, go down on me because I'd be that's too much my male persona feeling I'm getting a blowjob from a girl, but it's a guy, and that's messing with my whole gender, I'm straight or bi or whatever. And it would feel okay, now I have a dick or whatever. But now that I'm okay with my private parts, and now that I'm okay with feeling okay, it's my clit, this is how I see it, I'm okay with being a woman, and I'm more comfortable in my body and my sexuality, that if a guy goes down on me, I'm great, go down on me, and you're just, you're giving me head, and it's it's how you please me as a woman. This is just me. I'm more comfortable in that. And so there's that reintegration of taking some of that old and kind of moving it into a new way of experiencing things. So the old me would have just been discard that, no blowjobs, no head, because that's going to bring up the old guy. But now I am a woman and feeling that, so I can now get blowjobs again and feel totally fine. Great. That's what I wanted to achieve in my transition. By the way, fun fact, I get way more blowjobs as a girl than I ever did as a guy. I guess I was just not good at scoring blowjobs as a guy. Yeah, I that's an aside, but yeah, so that's a big piece is how you move through this integration of the old and the new. And there's kind of like this last piece that I want to touch on, which is not just integrating the old with the new, but also finding the new. And the new is this part of you that has always existed. So technically it's ancient, but you haven't given it space ever to exist because it's so repressed that it hasn't had fertile ground to grow. Yet the seed has always been there and has been latent in its ability to express. And this is super important with your consciousness and your self-power, because these parts of you, you have power, right? You have personal power. Do you know what I mean? Like you have an energy to yourself. And like that, if there are parts of yourself that are not being expressed and not living and not being in you, they're just sitting there, and you have energy that you can't leverage, you can't use, because it's just sitting there not being used, but it takes up space in your consciousness. So when you find these seedlings of yourself that you haven't given space to breathe and they start to blossom, suddenly you collect so much more power of who you are. I'm discovering that still today. The shift in my my experience of myself when I let in more femininity is it's like reality shifting to the point where it can be disorienting. And I'm going to go into this more into the femininity program that I'm going to be teaching sometime in February once I'm done with my surgeries, to really help other people come into this last stage of the transition, which I think is the most important one. So yeah, if you want to sign up for that, you can hit the newsletter and like sign up for the newsletter, and I'll send out an email when I launch that. But that's probably been the deepest thing that I'm kind of coming to terms with now, especially now that I've solidified my surgery. And I kind of talked about this in the surgery video I posted a few days ago. Yeah, that's it for today. I love you. Like and subscribe if this is new. Write me a comment down below if you're new. I'd love to hear from you, and I will see you tomorrow. Tschüss.